I like this vibe of Yaga where we build our own little town and we work in our own little specific way at specific hours, which is basically 24/7 for some of the people, you know. So my name is Emilia and I work with activities, healing area, workshop area, and discovery area, which is the lectures. We bring this message of, trying to find the golden middle. We know that people like to enjoy themselves, they like to party, they like to experiment. And Yaga's crowd are thinkers, I think, as well. And the discussions that we have are very beautiful. Lecturers that come, they usually are very bright in their subjects, and so they offer an opportunity and a place for people to find their voice that come to the lectures by encouraging them to speak. Because of my educational background, I have a lot of lecturers that want to come in. Well, not a lot, but I have some people that want to come in and speak in a different way, speak about topics that are a little bit controversial. This is a great place to explore that, and lately we've been really focusing on harm reduction, both in the ways how we party. Now this year we're going to have a love area, which is really special. I think it's probably the first Lithuanian festival that will have that kind of an area for safe sexual pleasure. We've tried to find these niche subjects. Another very important topic that we're going to be talking about, a beautiful Dr. Evelina is going to come and speak about natural medicines, natural ways of healing, but also like the problematic behind it. People in Yaga are a bit older, right, than a lot of other festivals. A lot of them are with families. That's why we have the kids space. We have a very cool program for the kids. We're gonna be pimping it up a little bit, that whole area as well for them. There's gonna be yoga teacher. We have an ergotherapist that's going to be working with the kids. So she's very skilled at what she does as well. And Smaragdo Miestas, they have a beautiful kindergarten in Antakalnis here in Vilnius. So really professionals are working with the kids as well. And that's what we're trying to, I think, do with the whole festival, do like a boutique experience, which is of good quality, but also wild enough to get lost and not necessarily follow like what's happening. You just go and you find new things. It's fine. You can read it in the program online. All of the workshops have little descriptions and links to the artists. Just know that it's an experience on its own. It's not just a festival that you go to. It's a gathering of people. It's a community, and it's a different kind of community. It's not the hippy dippy community. It's not the very fancy hipstery community. It's a little bit psychedelic, a little bit techno, a little bit artsy, a little bit contemporary. But most importantly, we just like to hang out. We like to hang out in the forest and just have a good time and not mess it up a little bit. We're very nice and clean and happy festival, happy group of people, and we like to share it with others. So come and experience us, and then bring your friends next year, and hopefully we'll do a Yaga somewhere in Bali at some point.